good news from Geneva. The World Health Organization has made it official. Smallpox throughout the world has been virtually eliminated.
Smallpox is the first and to date the only human disease to be eradicated globally.
The eradication of smallpox is one of the most significant events in the 20th century. For me, it would be up there with the moon landing.
The vaccine. Well, you should know by now that it goes into people. Yes, people in hospitals and clinics and schools, not only in Nyasaland but as far south as southern Rhodesia, get protection from the vaccine produced at Zomba. And not only people who live in towns, for if they don't go to clinics, the vaccine comes to them. Smallpox could flare up anywhere at any time, leaving death in its wake, were it not for the simple weapon that Edward Jenner placed in the hands of medical science.
On May 8, 1980, the World Health Organization announced the complete global elimination of the smallpox virus. The last human case of smallpox was reported in 1977. This is considered to be the greatest medical accomplishment achieved through vaccination. Ever since we were children, we have been told that if it were not for the mass vaccination campaign against smallpox, people would still be suffering from this terrible disease. But what if smallpox was never really eradicated? And furthermore, what if our idea of smallpox is fundamentally wrong? Today, we will examine this question in detail, and to do so, we will look at the scientific and historical facts that will help us gain a clear view of the situation. Most people believe that throughout our history, the term smallpox has always meant some specific condition. That is, it can easily be distinguished from any other disease by its unique and specific symptoms. In fact, this is not the case. Throughout history, the term smallpox has been used to refer to a wide variety of conditions. The same is true for such terms as leprosy and plague. In ancient Greece, which is the progenitor of modern Western medicine, any changes in the body or in the human psyche were perceived in a very negative way. Diseases were called defilement, which in Greek means miasma. It was believed that the sick person was unclean, that they had angered the gods, and were possessed by a demon. That person could not have any contact with other people because it was thought that contact with an unclean person could defile healthy people, and the punishment of the gods would extend to them as well. It was this ancient Greek superstition that formed the basis of the modern idea of contagion. It is important to note that in the most ancient forms of medicine, such as traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurveda, there is no concept of disease transmission because they never associated disease with punishment. At the time, it was a Western superstition that, among other things, served as a great way to generate fear, not only for material gain, but also to achieve political ends. In other words, it made it possible to label undesirable individuals as sick, dangerous, incurable, and contagious in order to make them disappear in quarantine, in a plague hut, or in a hospital. Anyone who has had anything to do with the creation and design of prisons knows that most prisons originated on the basis of hospitals. The same thing continued in the Middle Ages. In those days, just as in ancient Greece, in society prevailed the religiously motivated idea that sickness was punishment for sin. The popular term for this at the time was leprosy. The symptoms of what was then called leprosy were constantly changing, to the point where a person without any symptoms could be called a leper. The attitude towards so-called lepers always remained the same. A leper was considered unclean and dangerous and therefore excluded from society. They were tattooed and forced to wear special distinctive clothing and a bell around their neck to make their presence known to everyone. As an outcast, a leper lost all their societal rights as well as the protection of the community. The leper could no longer have any social contact. They had to leave their family. A funeral mass was conducted for the leper because socially they were considered dead, even though they were still alive. This is why the German word for leprosy, Aussatz, translates as exile. How was leprosy diagnosed at that time? For this purpose, they used medical tribunals, which were common throughout Europe. They are described by books containing urban chronicles from the 11th century. It was at these tribunals that priests and city councillors decided whether a person was a leper and whether they should be expelled or placed in a leper colony. Leprosy was not an independent or unique disease. Leprosy, at that time, meant almost any disease, whether respiratory or skin disease. You could be declared a leper for absolutely any reason, even for conditions like hair loss, acne, swelling, or goosebumps in response to a draft. One of the tests for leprosy was whether you got goosebumps on your skin. Because of things like nightmares, if you didn't please someone, that person could denounce you, saying you were screaming in your sleep because a demon called you. You could be convicted if you laughed or sang too much. Another notable test that was done to diagnose leprosy was the singing test. You could also have been accused if you were suspected of witchcraft or if you had had contact with someone who had been declared a leper. If you had any symptoms, you were doomed, but if you didn't have any, you could still have been declared a leper. In the 13th century, the term leprosy was replaced by the term plague, which meant exactly the same thing. Just like leprosy, plague included a variety of conditions. The plague never had a clear symptomatology. It varied from region to region and from year to year, depending on which symptoms were most common. Even now, when you read about plague, you can see so many forms of plague: pneumonic, bubonic, septicemic, and so on. You'll also see that not all epidemics named in historical sources the plague were epidemics of the very disease that today is called the plague. All of this allowed the Church, which at that time had all the power in its hands, to use the plague to control the population. For example, they could quell rebellions simply by closing entire neighborhoods and towns to quarantine, starving and killing people with the excuse that they were all sinners. In addition, people were subjected to forced treatment with mercury compounds of all kinds. So it is not surprising that medical historians tell us that in those days, people did everything possible to hide their symptoms, so as not to fall into the hands of the Inquisition, since sickness, the symptoms of any kind, were interpreted as the result of a lack of faith and the subsequent wrath of God. Consequently, people were treated only by authorized persons whose secret art was reserved for them alone, so that serious or dangerous illnesses could be treated only by them, the priests and the formed caste of doctors who still perform this function today. State power in Western countries has always taken care of the leadership and training of these elites, as is evidenced by their enormous power, especially today. The state suppressed and still suppresses all therapists who are independent, especially those whose therapeutic approaches work. Subsequently, the term plague was smoothly transformed into the term smallpox. Significantly, it was called smallpox or petit vérole, lesser evil, as opposed to great pox or gros vérole, greater evil, which meant syphilis. The term syphilis, like leprosy, plague and smallpox, was a collective term, but applied to people who were committing the greatest sin from the Church's perspective. The Vatican, with its virginity dogma, as well as Roman Catholic theology, which teaches the Immaculate Conception of Mary and thus declares all other people, especially women and sexuality as such, defiled, have concretized all these ideas in the concept of syphilis. The term syphilis is a collective concept and is a concretization of God's punishment for defiled people. If it became known that a person had an extramarital affair and had any actual or even merely presumed disease, pregnancy outside wedlock being on the list of diseases and considered a sin of the worst kind, they were especially stigmatized, not only by mercury treatments that disfigured and stained their skin, but also by exclusion from society. It was this concept that gave birth to the so-called venereal diseases, the so-called sexually transmitted diseases, which all governments are reverently guarding to this day, all the way up to modern-day AIDS. The term smallpox was used for conditions unrelated to sexuality or extramarital relations and applied to any skin symptoms, and in some regions, this term was also used for respiratory conditions and even cancerous tumors. In this connection, it should not surprise us that illustrations from the 13th to the 16th century did not clearly and unambiguously depict the so-called epidemic diseases. Modern medical historians often disagree on whether the artist intended to depict leprosy, smallpox, or plague. And in one of the earliest books on smallpox, dating from the early 16th century, one can see a depiction of the biblical character, Job. In the biblical texts, Job was a righteous man who fell ill with leprosy, so his image was often used in texts about leprosy. Those symptoms with which we associate smallpox today are not observed here. Gradually, as the power of the Vatican waned, after all the abuse and arbitrariness that came from the Church and the Inquisition, people ceased to have any trust for the religiously motivated explanations. Since then, diseases began to be explained by a purely materialistic interaction, and doctors took the same position that priests used to occupy before. As a result, the demon of disease was gradually materialized. The same idea of the demon of disease was transformed into the idea of the toxin of disease. People began to believe that diseases were caused by the so-called toxin of disease, which in Latin means virus, and that a person recovered because their body produced an antidote to the toxin of disease. This idea was supported by the fact that if a person regularly and systematically consumed poisons, such as alcohol, they could not be killed by a bigger quantity of this poison. So people who were afraid that someone might poison them, took poisons as a preventive measure, believing that they were invulnerable because their bodies were now producing an antidote to the poison. But in fact, as it turned out later, the body does not produce an antidote. Our liver produces enzymes to break down and neutralize these toxins. This is why a person who has never had alcohol can die if they drink a large amount of alcoholic beverage. Their liver is not used to producing enzymes to neutralize alcohol. But if a person drinks alcohol systematically little by little and gradually increases the dose, they will not die if they suddenly drink even more alcohol. This is something that people of the past did not understand. They didn't understand that our liver simply produces enzymes to neutralize alcohol and other poisons. They believed in the idea that their body produces an antidote. Because of this, they practiced such things as injecting pus and secretions from sick people through incisions on healthy people to form an antidote to the disease, thus protecting themselves from the disease. It was this misconception that gave rise to the idea of immunity to disease, the modern idea of antibodies and vaccination. For the same reason, they practiced bloodletting. This was supposed to drain and dilute the toxins of disease in the body. Because of this, however, a lot of people died, like Mozart, and especially hemophiliacs, people whose blood lacks clotting agents for certain reasons. Since it was observed that during famines and wars many people fell ill, before wars and other crises, people were treated with poisons or artificially produced so-called antidotes, such as mercury, which I have already mentioned. This is why mercury is still used in vaccines. The 1.5 liters of salivation per day, caused by treatment with mercury, was considered favorable because it was interpreted that the body was releasing the poison of the disease. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, in his work, Faust, describes precisely and understandably how Faust and his father, as doctors, killed thousands of people with a mercury mixture, and the survivors miraculously praised them as saviors. Goethe, in the first part of Faust. Their mercurial suitor, the Red Lion, would in a tepid bath be married to the Lily, then both be driven by tormenting flames out of one bridal chamber to another. When in the beaker the young queen at last appeared, a mass of color, that was our medicine, the patients died, and no one thought to ask if anyone was healed. And so, with diabolical electuaries, we ravaged in these hills and valleys with greater fury than the plague. I have myself dosed thousands with the poison. They wasted away, and I must live to hear the brazen murderers adulated. The point is that the materialization of the demon of disease into the concept of the toxin of disease, which in Latin means virus, gave rise to the idea of variolation, since it was thought that introducing the secretions of sick people to healthy people would cause the body to form an antidote to smallpox. Subsequently, the concept of the poison of disease was transformed into the modern idea of viruses and pathogenic bacteria, and variolation was replaced by vaccination. It was this that led doctors to the need to divide the nonspecific term smallpox, which was a single term for conditions accompanied by rashes, into many different small labels. Because this was the only way to show the effectiveness of variolation and vaccination against smallpox. Therefore, when people who had undergone variolation, and subsequently vaccination, developed symptoms that would previously have been called smallpox, instead of recognizing the ineffectiveness of vaccination, doctors began looking for minute difference in symptoms, on the basis of which they created new diagnoses. The truth is that so-called smallpox has never been eradicated. The only thing that has happened is that the symptoms previously associated with smallpox have simply been relabeled and reclassified under new labels. The creation of many new labels is the only method of manipulation used to this day, with the help of which the medical establishment demonstrates to us its success in eliminating the so-called epidemics. In addition, it is a mega-lucrative business model, because for each individual label they can create separate drugs, therapies, and vaccines. Only through this reclassification, the so-called smallpox was eradicated. What today we call chickenpox, monkeypox, tanapox, scarlet fever, measles, rubella, herpes zoster, erythema multiforme, molluscum contagiosum, impetigo, dermatitis, and so on, are the labels that were created to separate the previously unified term smallpox for conditions accompanied by rashes. All of these labels are simply different stages of the same detoxification process in which the skin is involved. As a consequence, there has been incredible confusion, because it has been very difficult, if not impossible, for doctors to differentiate smallpox from its newly created subspecies. We will now look at 3 examples of labels into which the term smallpox was divided: measles, chickenpox, and monkeypox. And I want to emphasize that we will not discuss the laboratory methods of diagnosis now, because at the time of the creation of these labels, physicians relied only on diagnosis based on symptoms. We will discuss laboratory diagnosis afterwards. The first person who had the idea to create a differential diagnosis for measles and smallpox, that is, to separate measles and smallpox as 2 different conditions, was a Persian physician named Rhazes, in the 9th century. His treatise on smallpox and measles is considered a masterpiece of clinical medicine and, according to some writers, describes the clinical difference between the 2 diseases so vividly that nothing has been added. Let's see how he thinks measles is different from smallpox. The eruption of the smallpox is preceded by a continued fever, pain in the back, itching in the nose, and terrors in the sleep. These are the more peculiar symptoms of its approach, especially a pain in the back with fever, then also a pricking which the patient feels all over his body, a fullness of the face, which at times comes and goes, an inflamed color, and vehement redness in both cheeks, a redness of both the eyes, heaviness of the whole body, great uneasiness, the symptoms of which are stretching and yawning, a pain in the throat and chest, with slight difficulty in breathing and cough, a dryness of the breath, thick spittle and hoarseness of the voice, pain and heaviness of the head, inquietude, nausea and anxiety. With this difference that the inquietude, nausea and anxiety are more frequent in the measles than in the smallpox, while on the other hand, the pain in the back is more peculiar to the smallpox than to the measles, heat of the whole body, an inflamed colon, and shining redness, especially an intense redness of the gums. When, therefore, you see these symptoms, or some of the worst of them, such as pain of the back and the terrors of sleep. With the continued fever, then you may be assured that the eruption of one or the other of these diseases in the patient is nigh at hand. Except that there is not in the measles so much pain of the back as in smallpox, nor in the smallpox so much anxiety and nausea as in measles, unless the smallpox be of a bad sort. As we can see, according to Reyes, the most important differences between measles and smallpox are the possible differences in the severity of back pain, nausea, and restlessness. Based on his treatise on measles and smallpox, apart from these minor differences in the severity of certain symptoms, both smallpox and measles share common symptoms of the disease. A Persian physician named Ibn Sina lived a century later than Reyes, and experts agree that in his book entitled The Canon of Medicine, he largely copied Reyes' treatise on smallpox and measles and also separated measles and smallpox as separate diseases, in no way referring to Reyes or acknowledging his work. He wrote, "The physical signs of measles are almost the same as those of smallpox, but nausea and inflammation are more severe, although the back pain is less." Another Persian physician named Masudi died in 994, about 70 years after Reyes. In the 14th chapter of the first volume of his book Treatise on the Art of Medicine, he talked about smallpox, but he considered smallpox and measles the same disease. Another physician named Ibn Zur lived in Al-Andalus and died there in 1162. His book on medicine was translated into Hebrew and then Latin and was published many times under the title Facilito Agimentum. In the second volume of this book, Ibn Zur devoted a chapter to smallpox and measles, considering them the same disease. As we can see, there was no consensus among Persian physicians as to whether measles and smallpox were completely different diseases or simply different expressions of the same process. Difficulties in the differential diagnosis of measles and smallpox continued until smallpox was declared eradicated. In the article Smallpox and Measles, Historical Aspects and Clinical Differentiation, published in the Journal of Infectious Diseases Clinics of North America, we can read the following. Because smallpox was not differentiated readily from other febrile exanthems, for example measles, the contagious potential of smallpox probably was not appreciated in antiquity. In the ancient world, measles and smallpox existed together. Measles, also known as morbilli, is the diminutive Italian term derived from morbillo. The term morbilli was used to differentiate the small plague of measles from the Great Plague, referred to as il morbo. For centuries, scarlet fever, rubella, measles, and smallpox were undifferentiated, that is, considered to be the same, febrile diseases with rashes. The terminology of measles is confusing, as is the clinical differentiation between measles and chickenpox. Sir William Osler, the famous Canadian clinician, in the late 19th century described the difficulty doctors had trying to distinguish between measles and smallpox. Quote, "I found in the ward one morning a young man who had been sent in on the previous evening with a diagnosis of smallpox. He had a fading macular rash with distinct small papules, which had not however the shoddy hardness of variola. In the evening this rash was less marked, and as I felt sure that a mistake had been made, he was disinfected and sent home. In another instance a child believed to have smallpox was admitted, but it proved to have simply measles. In a third case, which I saw at the city hospital, the mottled papular rash was mistaken for smallpox and the young man sent to the hospital. I saw him the day after admission, when there was no question that the disease was measles and not variola. Less fortunate than the other cases, he took smallpox in a very severe form. The general condition of the patient and the nature of the prodromal symptoms are often better guides than the character of the rash." In a 1988 WHO document entitled Smallpox and Its Eradication, we read, "Historically, measles did not present a problem in countries with endemic smallpox, that is, in countries where smallpox was common, but in non-endemic countries, where smallpox was rare. An early case of smallpox was sometimes diagnosed as measles, with possibly serious consequences in terms of secondary cases. On the other hand, in countries in which smallpox was endemic, Physicians were often prone to diagnose all outbreaks of rash associated with deaths as smallpox and to report them as such to the health authorities. Some of these outbreaks later proved to be due to measles. So, we can clearly see that on the basis of symptoms alone, which were nonspecific and overlapping, doctors had great difficulty in diagnosing measles and smallpox. Now let's see how easy it was for doctors to tell the difference between smallpox and chickenpox. In a 1979 publication entitled Smallpox and the Evolution of Ideas on Acute Viral Infections, published in the Journal of Medical History, we can read, in trying to assess the influence wielded by smallpox on social and political history, or just to determine the chronology of the disease, one is hampered by the inability to identify the disease with any degree of certainty from extant descriptions before AD 900, and sometimes much later. The virus of smallpox is known to vary in virulence, that is, to produce symptoms of varying severity. And inaccurate or inadequate descriptions of the clinical picture offer rich opportunities for confusion with a number of other fevers accompanied by rashes and pustules. Here they say that throughout history the term smallpox has been used without describing a clear clinical picture, making it difficult to know which set of symptoms should be called smallpox. The quote continues, Dixon has provided a sober account of the known early history of the disease, and of the difficulties inherent in attempts to identify it in retrospect. He points out that the abundant lesions on the face and body of the mummified Ramesses V, who died about 1100 BC of an acute infectious disease, are very similar to those of malignant smallpox. It is therefore curious that there is no mention of smallpox in Hippocrates' otherwise copious volumes of clinical descriptions, nor elsewhere in the Greek and Roman medical literature according to Dixon, although some other authors have attempted to identify destructive epidemics which contributed to the decline of the Roman Empire in the 3rd and 4th centuries as outbreaks of smallpox. Nor does contemporary terminology in any way clarify the issue. Even when the term variola, from the Latin smallpox, first appeared, it was not accompanied by a clinical description, and we have no way of knowing whether or not it referred to smallpox. For several hundred years after the introduction of the terms variola and morbilli, from Italian measles, the diseases they refer to can in no certain way be distinguished as smallpox and measles, respectively, on the basis of the inadequate clinical descriptions. In the case of smallpox, the confusion with chickenpox further clouds retrospective epidemiological considerations. This source goes on to say that the first person who decided to classify smallpox and chickenpox as separate entities was an English physician, William Heberden, in 1767. Before him, no one even had such an idea. The term chickenpox, or varicella in Latin, has been around for a long time. It comes from the Latin variola, which as we know means smallpox and was applied to smallpox with a mild course. William Heberden's idea of separating smallpox and chickenpox as two different entities was not accepted until over a century later in the early 1900s. And even then many physicians and researchers disagreed with it. In their opinion, it was much more logical to view smallpox and chickenpox as different expressions of the same disease. As Heberden pointed out, he chose to do this in order to prevent the public from confusing chickenpox with regular smallpox and assuming that they were now immune to smallpox and therefore did not need the smallpox vaccine. So, let's see if Heberden has provided an actual proof of two different diseases caused by two different viruses. Keep in mind that in those days viruses could not be seen and their existence as well as their role in disease were based on conjecture, rather than on concrete evidence, just as today. William Heberden published his report on the clinical differences between smallpox and chickenpox in 1767, and after reading it, the following points can be distinguished. 1. He wrote that chickenpox can occur without any preceding disease or signs, but in many cases, as in smallpox, it is preceded by symptoms such as chills, fatigue, cough, insomnia, migratory pains, loss of appetite, and fever for 3 days. 2. Most pustules in chickenpox are the same size as those in smallpox, but sometimes smaller. 3. At maturity, a yellowish fluid appears, which is very similar to smallpox. 4. Heberden tried to distinguish chickenpox from smallpox by claiming that the rash does not leave scars, but he concedes that if it is scratched too much or the rash is more pronounced, an ulcer will form on the skin, as in the case of smallpox. 5. Heberden argued that chickenpox differs from smallpox in two main ways. 1. The appearance, on the second or third day after eruption, of a vesicle filled with serum on top of the pustule.